Good evening and welcome to another Pastor's Talk. I am Bobby, this is Daniel, this is Nick, and this is our kind of Ask Us Anything show on Sunday or Wednesday nights. And so if you have specific questions you'd like to ask us about anything at all, we talk about sometimes current events, sometimes theology, church history, parenting. We've talked about so many topics, and if you have specific questions you'd like to ask us tonight, please do that. You can submit those questions to Redemption. Text the word Redemption to, and the number part, 94,000. And we will get those questions. You can write the body of your question after the word Redemption, and we will try to answer them as best we can if we have time. And if not, we will get to them next time. So tonight, we didn't get really a specific question. But, with a lot of some of our own conversations we've had recently, with this coronavirus situation, we've kind of talked about coronavirus a while ago, but it still is around. Yeah. And we realize there are a lot of states who are acting differently when it comes to coronavirus.
Correct.
There's a lot of regulations in place. There's mask mandates. Some people have no mask mandates. In Weber County specifically, we do not have a mask mandate in coming to church. Now, we've asked people, if you feel strongly about this, to wear a mask, but we try to follow the guidelines put forth by our county. Now, other states have stronger mandates, wear a mask, or maybe it's limited to a certain number of people. In the state of California right now, they're saying no church services, right? I think it's like none at all. I mean, they can't even meet in homes.
Yeah. No indoor. For more than 50 people. But
I think they're also saying there's no home gatherings as well.
I thought I heard
that was something that California has also put into place.
Or maybe Nevada was the 50 people.
Yeah, Nevada was 50.
And then recently, there was a church in Nevada. I think it was a Calvary Chapel church.
Yes.
And they were wanting to meet. And they were saying, wait a second, the casino's around. And a lot of these other institutions can open and have more than 50 people a part of their services. Or part of their business.
They can have up to 50% capacity, which
50%
for some of those casinos, that's a lot of people. They're huge.
Right. But the churches, though, had different guidelines. So they asked the court for some relief against the Supreme Court. I think I don't went all the way that far. For some relief against this order. And the Supreme Court ruled in a 5-4 split decision against the Church of Calvary Chapel and for the state of Nevada. Now that has huge implications. And as we're talking through this issue, a lot of people want to know, when is it okay to go against the state, and when should we basically do what the state asks us to do? Is there a time to ever go against the state, or should we always do what the state asks us to do? And again, the bigger issue, John MacArthur in California, very well-known, prominent evangelical pastor, written tons of books, commentaries. He's recently said, we are going to have church service, and they are not taking any precautions. There's no social distancing, there's no masks, there's no anything of those things. And California said no church services.
Well, I think even that one too. John MacArthur, a few months prior, maybe April, said, hey, we're going to obey the law of the court, District 9, whatever it is. I'm trying to be obedient to that. And then now has changed, and there's reasons for that, but I think that's something that's confusing people as well, as the shift in change, because I think I read today they said 40% of the year has gone by where they've been out of church. And I think that kind of was part of that shift. That's just important. I think some people are confused on John MacArthur's decision, because just months earlier, he's like, we need to obey. And then now he's like, all right, we're done obeying. So,
right.
It's interesting.
Right. And so I think just as we talk through this issue, I kind of wanted to talk through that tonight, just maybe as we can discuss maybe this particular issue, and maybe the biblical principles behind what should guide our conversation and thought, and then how should we deal with this. One is our own church, and then two is we deal with maybe other churches around, brothers and sisters in Christ, who agree on matters of orthodoxy, but where we may differ on one side or the other when it comes to this particular topic of when is it okay to go against the state, and when should we say yes to the state? Now, just talk about maybe some of the extremes. there's some out there, a growing opinion that would say the highest authority in the land is the Constitution. And so they would say, we go by the Constitution, so when a governor goes against the Constitution, we ignore them, and we do what the Constitution tells us to do.
Mm-hmm.
There's probably another, on the other extreme, there's another group that would be like, well, we'll do whatever the state tells us to do, no matter what it is. We'll do it, we'll abide by it, even if it's something we don't like, even if it may even violate our conscience from a biblical standpoint. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I've seen probably both of those extremes, if you want to call them extremes, in the last 3 or 4 months. I think, like everything, honestly, that we've been through in the last 3 or 4 months, there's so much complexity, and you've already touched on that, but there's so much complexity to this whole situation because, one, each state has, we are the United States of America. There are state laws, there are federal laws, there are Supreme Court decisions that affect what a governor can or can't do, or what a state can or can't do. So I think probably part of the issue is, especially with Christians who maybe are more on the John MacArthur side, and I don't want to speak for him, but maybe they were willing to abide by the government until they saw it completely hypocritical, and where the rule wasn't being applied equally across the board. What I mean by that is, when this whole thing started, there were a lot of Christians who, when they started getting these mandates for their churches, were crying persecution. We're crying, we're going to meet anyway, you can't stop us. But the problem with that is they were applying that rule, the government was, in most cases, across the board. So, they weren't targeting churches. They were saying this is the rule, whether it was 10 people or 5 people.
Yeah, early on and back in March,
Yeah.
I mean, there was pretty much a stop on everything. Yeah. Restaurants closed down, except maybe Walmart and Home Depot. Yeah. The only 2 places you could go to. Yeah. But apart out of those 2 cases, everything else shut down.
All our kids came home.
Schools shut down.
Yeah. And so I think
everything.
At that point, I was at least comfortable saying, okay, if it's a generally applied rule, they're not targeting any group, and it's supposed to be temporary to help flatten the curve or whatever the talk was at the time. That's fine.
And I would say too, we're kind of hitting more MacArthur's side at the moment. I want to talk about the other side, treat this issue fairly. Mm-hmm. But I would say from MacArthur's side, I mean, you could also make the case that in March we didn't know as much as we know about this that we today, and we still don't know. I mean, when it comes to this whole coronavirus thing, none of us are epidemiologists. Mm-hmm. We studied Bible. We don't have an epidemiology background. But I think now we know a lot more than we did. Mm-hmm. That may or may not help us. Right. There's at least more knowledge, right?
Yeah. Right. So as time has gone on, though, it seems as though there have been instances, which is why the case got brought to the Supreme Court from Nevada, where there was a lot of inconsistency, and there was a lot of doublespeak, and there was a lot of almost blatant hypocrisy, it seemed like, from what the government was saying. And the biggest thing, whether it's allowing casinos to open and not churches, whether it was not only allowing massive protests but encouraging it, but saying that a church can't meet, I think at some point people started going, wait, this is not a generally applied rule anymore. Mm-hmm. What do we do now? And that may be why MacArthur changed his point of view. I think in addition to that, after the first month or so, churches were starting to do outdoor services, which was doable in April, even in May. But now it's July, August, and if you're in California, specifically where his church is located, it's not San Diego where it's nice and 70 degrees every day. It gets hot there. They had to ask the question, can we keep this up? And I think all of those things are part of that decision that he made, right or wrong. Mm-hmm. And it's easy to attack one side or the other based on your opinion, but it's just so complex.
One specifically to him, he said this, Insofar as government authorities do not attempt to assert ecclesiastical authority or issue orders that forbid our obedience to God's law, then the authority is to be obeyed. So I think for him, it was like, as long as the government authority is not changing our ability to be obedient to the Word of God, we will
You
always...
said that recently or before?
I believe that was even recently, but comparing the difference...
Because I would push back on that a little bit. Because
and that's what I'm saying.
Well, and I think I want to hit the other side.
Yeah, sorry.
So I want to tease out, like right now okay, MacArthur has a case here.
You're right.
In a second, we're going to hit MacArthur doesn't have a case here and talk about the other issue.
Yeah.
But I think for MacArthur does have a case. Well, we are saying that, just to kind of summarize that, arguably, it seems like the rule is being applied inconsistently. And I think to that point, he's saying, hey, as long as we can keep our conscience of following God's law, which we're saying we believe the state is maybe operating against that. And I think thirdly of saying, now that we have more information, maybe we can do more here with. And I think I've heard MacArthur say in response to some interview, he said, if you really look at the population of California, the chances of you dying in California from coronavirus are like 0.0002% or something like that. That's not out of the people who get it, percentage of people who get it, and the percentage of those people die. It's a very small number of people who actually get it and then will die from as a result of it. Now, again, that's his side.
Right,
that's what he's suggesting out there as an actual argument for, not for meeting in spite of what the government has said, you can't have church. Now, that's California.
Right.
That's not everywhere. And we said different states have different mandates, different laws. Utah, on the other hand, has been pretty open as far as the other states go. I mean, Weber County, we don't have mask mandates. I mean, there's a lot of other states out there that have been more open, who have a full state mask mandate. South Carolina, where I'm from, they don't have a state requirement, but every county there has basically put a mask mandate on. So to go to the grocery store, to go to church, to go wherever you go, you have to wear a mask.
Well, in South Carolina, too, the numbers are drastically different than Utah's. The percentage of coronavirus cases there is significantly different than here.
But I mean, just from a strictly standpoint of what the state will allow, Utah is very different than California.
Correct.
We're weighing apples and oranges here as far as requirements.
Right.
I think kind of give some groundwork too to this whole situation. I mean, you brought up one example before we started, but I just thought of another one, same era. But you think back to the late 1930s, early 1940s, and a lady like Corrie ten Boom, who was a believer. She also loved her fellow Jews.
Time of World War II.
Yeah, and in her situation, the law or the governing authorities, it was mandated that you did not hide Jews. That Jews to be taken to camp. Well, they didn't know at the time they were being taken to camps necessarily, but you could not hide people who were Jewish. And she defied the government to save the lives of those who otherwise would have been shipped off to a concentration camp or taken somewhere else.
Well, I use an example on Sunday of the Huguenots. I mean, same thing. A whole village in France were hiding Jews in their village. I mean, the whole village was conspiring together against the government that ruled them at the time because they felt like it violated a biblical requirement there to protect life and to love neighbor.
Right. Now, don't hear me saying that I'm making our current situation equal to that at all.
Right.
No, but I think where your point is, though, there is a time.
Yeah.
There may be a time where we have to go against the state, right?
Cross the line.
That's the biggest
For sure.
point I was trying to make is there have been times in history, and there will be more probably, where it is a big enough situation to where you have to make the decision. And it's based on conscience. It's also based on what you believe the Word of God teaches. And there's been other things like that in history. But that's just one that came to mind.
Well, I mean, let's talk for a second for Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer was one of the most prolific Christian writers around the same time of World War II.
Yep.
And Bonhoeffer, again, pastor, there's a pastor here. He's involved in a plot, a big conspiracy to get Hitler killed, so much so where they sneak a bomb into his meeting room. It actually goes off. Hitler is, I think, above the table, and the bomb's below the table. The blast is absorbed by the table underneath, this huge oak table. Hitler lives. Bonhoeffer gets killed once his plot is discovered. Pastor's involved in a plot to kill the highest authority of the land, right?
Yeah.
Now, like when we talk about this, the big question, the passage that comes up a lot is Romans chapter 13. Verse 1, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. Now let's take, for example, just this context. It talks about taxes, paying taxes. Now let's ignore America for a second. Let's go back into ancient times. Roman emperors. You had guys like Nero, Caligula, Domitian. These were emperors who actively persecuted Christians. Nero would take Christians and he would light them up with oil at his garden parties. He would throw them into the Colosseum and watch them be torn apart by lions. He did this for entertainment. He blamed the Christians for the fire in Rome. Caligula lost his mind and would do all kinds of other crazy stuff to Christians. Same with Domitian. Tax collectors, we know in the times of Jesus that Jews would charge, there were tax collectors who worked for the Roman government. They would charge an exorbitant amount of taxes so they could profit personally and then also pay their tax off to Rome. So these were not always honorable people, my point. So when you read Romans chapter 13, I think we need to take into account that this there's not a provision there for when people are honorable and when they're dishonorable. Would it be fair to say from a good exegesis of Romans 13? But I think there are some who would say the highest law of the land is the Constitution. We go back to America. So therefore, if a governor does not follow the Constitution appropriately, it's our job to put him in check. And that means if taxes are being used for things we don't want tax money to be used for, then we don't have to pay taxes. We can also take our whoever is in charge, and we don't have to listen to them if we don't like the law. I don't think that is what he's talking about here. I don't think you can use Romans 13. I think it's bad exegesis to go that direction and start interpreting it as we don't have to follow the law of the land when we don't like the law of the land. But there is a time, and Christians would do this, when we have to go against the state.
Well, I mean, if you've been here on Sundays, you've heard several stories in a row of the book of Daniel where the men of God, Daniel and the three, they didn't necessarily riot in the streets against the laws. They didn't, throw a big hullabaloo over it. But when it came down to laws that actually were really not created because the person in power wanted them to, they were created to entrap those men. Either way, they had the choice of either bowing down and worshiping man or God. They chose God, but they did that knowing that their life could be taken from them. Now, in the two biggest stories, the lion's den and the fiery furnace, God saved both groups, Daniel and the group of three, both times. And God received glory and honor through that, obviously, because the king or whoever ended up praising Yahweh for it. But the point is, I do think, because you could read Romans 13 and go, okay, well, we always have to obey every time, even if it goes against what we believe is right. But then there's other examples in Scripture specifically where that's not the case. I mean, again, Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, because what they were being asked to do directly defied God's law, they chose to go with what God said and not what man mandated. And again, God took them out and He saved them,
One thing,
which is awesome. But
to that point, if you're looking at the whole context of Daniel, there were probably thousands of times before that they could have had issue. I mean, they were stolen from their home. They weren't chosen. They didn't choose to go to Babylon. They could have every step of the way fought something, and probably everyone would have been like, "Yeah, I get it."
Well, yeah, I mean, there's idol worship all around.
Yeah, and chose not to make that. Now, not that they worshipped idols, but they didn't go after everything.
They didn't fight the culture's idol worship. Though.
Right.
I mean,
yeah, it was
think
their
about,
own.
Again, this is a secular worldview. This is a pagan worldview. We see, and I don't know if Babylon was guilty of this or not, but in pagan cultures, they would do child sacrifices, where they would sacrifice children to pagan idols. Daniel was a defeated army, a defeated nation. They lost. Now, he stood up to the king when he was put before the king. But as far as we can see in Scripture, there were few battles.
Yeah.
Right? You see Daniel 4, Daniel 5, there's 50 years in between Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar. Well, what happened in between there?
Yeah, it's not written about.
I mean, we don't know what he did or he didn't. So we're arguing from silence so much, but I think it's to say the Bible did not at least show us any account where Daniel was constantly going for the king. Your false worship, your false worship, your false worship, this is evil, this is wrong.
Right.
He did stand up to the king, but as far as we can tell, this wasn't something that happened every day.
And typically, the prophets who did say those things were saying that to the nation of Israel.
Yep.
They were harsh on their own people.
Yeah.
Again, they weren't telling whoever was in charge at the time. So when you do read that kind of language, it's almost always, if not always, aimed at God's people.
The people of God.
Saying, turn from your wicked ways, worship the Lord your God, and it happens a lot throughout the prophets, the books of the prophets.
So let's kind of maybe show the other side here. John MacArthur, who says, hey, I'm going to stand up against the state. We're going to have service anyways. Let's maybe hit the counterpoint to that. What maybe should we think about, or maybe some reasons why? Because in California right now, there are churches who are abiding by that order. And they believe they're doing it to follow Jesus.
Yeah.
So what's the other side?
And I would venture to guess, I've not spoken to any of these churches, but their probably thought process is, hey, we're going to love our community well by one, caring for their safety and health, by showing grace in this season by being obedient to the law of the land, not being obstinate, I don't know if that's the right word, but...
So they believe that maybe they're putting their communities at risk or of death possibly by meeting together.
Or making them a priority by not. Yeah.
I think for me the biggest counterpoint to his stance or his whatever he said, and again I'll be honest, I don't know what I would do if I were in issues.
Yeah, and I think we're saying here too, this matter is really tricky.
Oh, very much so.
So right now you got people very strongly, we're against the state has overreached, gone way too far, and there are those who've said, man, to love neighbor, we don't want to cause our community pain and trauma and death, and if we are contributing to that, it's shame on us. I get both sides, right? And we're realizing this is a tough conflict here.
So my counter to that would be, does meeting in a big building that seats 4, 8, I don't know how big their church building is, but that seats
several thousand people.
Several thousand people. Is that the only way to worship?
Right.
I mean, we heard time and time again when this first hit. I heard people say it, I saw memes about it, and I agree with it, although sometimes they were were said in jest and more of a pointing your finger. But just because the church building is closed doesn't mean the church is closed. And I agree with that.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, I think in America for too long we've equated the building with the church. We've equated however it is you do worship on a Sunday, that's worship. And we have to be really careful not to think that way, because when we go to South Asia, when we go to other parts of the world, they ain't doing anything like what we do on Sunday mornings.
No.
And it's still worship. So my point is, I get where he's coming from, but I also
Right,
think...
to your point real quick, J.D. Greer in Church in North Carolina, they've said, we realize we cannot meet how we normally meet. So what we're going to do is we're going to meet in houses. Now, in their state, they can meet that
Right,
way.
that's not
They can meet in houses.
Yeah.
There's no mandate against it.
Yeah.
We're going to do this for missional reasons, for worship, and maybe it's a time to teach our church what worship really is about, and we don't make an idol of Sunday morning.
Well, I remember years ago when we were still in the theater over here, and the power went out
Oh yeah, I
because of a
remember that day.
windstorm. Dude, it was the weirdest thing. I've never experienced a windstorm like that, except for during a hurricane in Louisiana. But the power went out, and even though we usually already didn't really have heat or air conditioning, depending on the Sunday, we definitely didn't that time. We didn't have lights, and we took that opportunity.
So no sound amplification.
Yeah, no, I stood up there with my acoustic guitar. That was it. No microphones, nothing.
I remember that because I went to Walmart and bought like
About like 500
I
flashlights.
bought a
Oh, no,
lot
500.
amount of flashlights out of Walmart.
Batteries,
Like, they only-
candles.
They love
candles, yeah.
And we could have that time said, oh, you know, there's no power. Let's just not meet. But instead, we prayed about it really quickly, and then we thought, you know what? This could be cool. This could help teach our church that worship on Sunday doesn't have to be one set way.
Yeah.
We can do it in the dark. We can do it with a flashlight. We can do it with no instruments. We can do it with lots of instruments. And again, we could have just said, you know, well, let's just not show up. And our crowd was smaller that day, of course, obviously. But people came, and I think most of the people there, not everybody, really enjoyed it, because it was almost like we were experiencing what probably the majority of Christians around the world experienced to some extent, especially those who are in the persecuted world. So all that to say, the pushback I would have against that is meeting in a big building. Now, if the government said you can't gather at all, anywhere, any place, anytime, because we don't like your God, we don't like your religion, obviously, that's very different.
Well, I mean, that's what's happening in China this very moment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The basically the president, the emperor, the whoever, you know, what he calls himself, has basically said, I'm not okay with any Christianity, any form of meeting,
Right.
houses, whatever it is,
Yeah.
and if you don't worship me, then this is not going to work.
Right.
You don't get to have church. At that point, church is still going to meet. And again, like you said, it's going to look probably different than what we do
Right.
on Sunday mornings. But
So
they're
I
gonna
guess
meet
my
in
question
houses.
would be, could there have been a way to abide by the government and still have the gathered assembly of the people, even if it's not 4,000 people sitting in an auditorium? My first inclination is to say, yeah, there probably could have been some. I mean, we've been making adjustments on the fly for the last 4 months.
Right.
I would
You know,
even.
not that we want to, but
I would add to that too, though, for anyone being careful. We've already talked about this, because every state is different. Everyone wants to treat every church situation the same. Like California should do what we're doing. Well, we already talked about Utah not being in Weber County is entirely, but that's what's happening right now. Is we just get on Facebook and we assume everyone's on the same page and in the same circumstance of concern, and so disobeying the governing authorities here and disobeying them here don't look the same, because the government, like we had family who didn't understand that we were able to go out and about to Home Depot and Walmart. Like, oh, you're not locked in? No, we're locked in. Actually, our governor made a concern for us. He wants us out on the mountains and on the trails, and mental health is important. We're in Illinois. Everyone was like, no, stay in your building. Don't go out. And so I think it's careful too, as we're looking at that in judgment, just remembering that piece, because it's tricky. All 50 states are different, and
Well, and I think another thing, just to make sure we're careful about this, and I think both sides of this debate are guilty, is that we start looking at scientific data, and we're backseat epidemiologists. So we start looking at something, we read a study, we don't know what we're reading, we read a headline, and we start running with it. And both sides of this debate. And so part of the problem with the social media world we live in is you read a headline, you go crazy on it.
Yeah.
One side or the other. And I think that's one of the major problems we have in our culture is that we can't have a real honest conversation. And so those who are, MacArthur's in the wrong. All right, maybe he is in the wrong. Maybe other churches might be in the wrong. But I don't think reading a headline on Facebook is going to help you figure out who's right and who's wrong. I'm pretty sure those who are actually looking at this data are probably reading more than just a Facebook headline. I would hope so.
Yeah.
And maybe they aren't. Maybe they're doing what we're doing too, and we're all in trouble. But my point is, I think we just need to be really careful. And so in that, just like with anything in life, if you have a friend you disagree with on an issue, and both of you love Jesus and you're trying to work it out, you should probably expect the best out of them first. So when we see a John MacArthur, maybe our first impulse isn't to go, that's my boy, he's doing it, and all these other churches who aren't doing it are in sin.
Yeah.
Or the opposite and go, no, John MacArthur is in sin, he's trying to hurt people, he's trying to destroy people's lives. Maybe we need to take a step back, and again, not to play like this moral neutral position, but to go, we may not have all the information. And I think it's a very smart place for us to be in often.
Yeah.
Where in situations where we don't have all the information, that we don't have to have an opinion on something. And we live in this culture where you have to have an opinion on everything. And if you don't have an opinion, you hate people. Or you hate Jesus. And it's like, really?
Or if you have an opinion and you don't share it
Yeah.
for all the world to see, well, you must not care.
Right.
You must not have any kind of...
Yeah. Well, we've talked about this before, and this is where something I pray for John MacArthur. Every leader right now has never been put in a position like they're in now, and there's not a chance that they can make everyone happy. It's just not even a
Nope, there's not a class in seminary, there's not a book
There's
you can
no
read
way.
on the
Well,
pandemic of 2020.
that goes for church leaders. That also goes just for government leaders.
Yeah.
Any kind of
School
leadership.
administrators.
The healthcare leaders in counties and states. It's not just us, just church leaders. It's every leader.
Well,
Right now, teachers. Man,
Yeah.
teachers are in a lose-lose situation. School administrators are in a lose-lose situation. There are people who say we shouldn't go back to school. There's the opposite who say we need to go back to school.
Yeah.
There are people who say we need to wear masks. We shouldn't wear masks. We have all these competing positions, and who's stuck in the middle? Teachers who are already underpaid, and they're dealing with extra stress, and there are people telling them they should quit their jobs, and there are some teachers who are afraid because they're reading headlines. They're like, am I going to be safe if I go back to school? Other teachers are like, I want to work, and I don't want to do this online thing. And we're just blasting people instead of just saying man, showing them the grace of Jesus.
Well, my wife is a 6th grade teacher, and she went back this week. Every day she's come home because everything's changing every day. They get told something, and then she prepares for it. And she's a planner, so she goes in and makes it.
It's the wrong year for planners.
It's totally. This is a year for me because I don't make plans. She goes in, and it's not anyone's fault, but it totally shifts the next day. They're told a new thing. And then, on top of all that, nothing's consistent. There's no stability. Not intentionally. It's just the nature of the way things are playing themselves out. And I was even thinking too, as a Christian, you may have strong conviction and your opinion may not be a wrong opinion, but someone could also have an opposing opinion and not be a wrong opinion. And you guys don't have to meet on the same level for you both to love Jesus and do this well. And so whether it's your church or school, wherever you're at, you really kind of need to calm down and recognize that not everyone is really where you are. And because here's the truth, right? If I want you to agree with me on something, I can't force it. I can't just tell you no, agree with me. It doesn't work that way. We'll present a case. We can try to be persuasive. But at the end of the day, everyone's still choosing to believe in what they believe in. So it just creates this chaotic all the way around, like you said, healthcare. I've talked to people on both sides of that fence in healthcare. It's insane right now.
And I think it's something for us to also consider when you understand the scientific method. So the scientific method is, okay, we have a hypothesis. We test that hypothesis through observation and experimentation, and then we make conclusions based on this hypothesis. So you think, okay, coronavirus, the novel coronavirus means it's a new one. New coronavirus, we don't have a lot of data. So we're watching the scientific method in progress. They're trying different treatments, they're trying vaccines, they're looking at different approaches. There's still data we just don't have. I'm a data guy, I love seeing the data, I love seeing the numbers and figuring out what it is, but you're dealing with something brand new. So we're expecting our government leaders to understand something that's brand new,
Yeah.
our school administrators to understand something that's brand new, and then our pastors to understand something that's brand new and make decisions based on this. There are going to be some who take more of a cautious approach and some who a less cautious approach. That this is not an issue of like we know definitively right and wrong here. It's not like a theological thing where we look at and go, no, this doesn't fit orthodoxy. We know that Jesus is fully man and fully God. If you step out of those lines from a theological standpoint, I can point and say, no, that's heretical teaching. This of what we do with our approach to coronavirus, we're not dealing with orthodoxy and heresy. We're dealing with a matter of wisdom.
Yeah.
When it comes to matters of wisdom, you're going to have even more disagreement on what's wise and what's unwise.
Yeah, I had a discussion this week with a family member who was basically just expressing their not disappointment, but they were just saying, at their church, it's just different, and they're meeting again, but not many people have come back, and it's just like, I just want it to be like it used to be. And I said, you know what? It may not ever be exactly like it used to be. But I tried to tell this person, take whatever situation we're in, we can't control it, and look for ways that God is receiving glory through it.
That's good.
And whether, I would say that's something we should abide by, whether it's coronavirus or not. Whether it's your child has cancer, whether it's you just lost your house, whatever it is, things that are uncomfortable to us, things that we don't like, that hurt us, that aren't good, we can understand and acknowledge that we don't like it, but we can also take the perspective of, okay, I don't like this, but how am I seeing God work through this? And we've got countless testimonies. I sent out an email to our church partners this week about some of the disappointments of this summer, things that we didn't do that we always do every summer, in terms of outreach, in terms of having mission teams come. All of that got canceled, like everything else in 2020. That was really disappointing. It was a weird summer for us because we weren't able to do what we've always done as a church. And yet, we've seen some really cool things develop over the last couple of months. We've seen new people in our fellowship. We've had young couples move to this area and get involved in ministry. And so you could just go, well, everything's different, I don't like it. Or you could say, okay, due to the fact that things are weird, that we're online only. I mean, we had people watching our services back in March that have never stepped foot into a church. They were watching, they were hearing the gospel, maybe for the first time, because of the coronavirus. And so, how can we take a situation like this that's uncomfortable and that we don't like, and instead of just complaining about how bad it is, and I'm not saying that to be trite, I'm really not. I'm just saying you can look for where God is working even in the midst of something that really stinks. So that's kind of secondary to the main point of our discussion. But when we think about the churches who maybe still can't meet physically because the government said they can't, whether it's California or Nevada or wherever else, I would just encourage those people, one, I don't know what you're dealing with because your situation, your context is not mine, but two, what are some ways that you could see positives come out of this? And I think one example is the one, the J.D. Greer thing you mentioned, where now they've mobilized probably thousands of little house churches all over Raleigh-Durham, North Carolina, whereas used to they would come all together Sunday mornings. Now they're spread out. it's actually even more, a little bit more like what we read about in the New Testament in Acts, and the way that churches were back then. And so they might see this as an opportunity rather than a detriment to their church.
Well, you know, I know J.D. Greer's church at one point, their goal was to plant, I think, 1,000 churches, and I don't remember their time frame. Wouldn't it be just like God to use this to make them 1,000 churches?
Yeah.
And
It's hypothetical, but yeah, you're right. I mean, they're spread out now. When this is all said and done, there might be a house church that goes, we've really reached this neighborhood that we've never reached before because we were actually meeting in our home and not driving 20 minutes to the campus.
Yeah.
Let's start a church here. Like, how cool would that be? You know?
Well, and I think another thing here too, we love to think of America as being a Christian nation. But you know what? The gospel seems to flourish when nations are not Christian nations.
Yeah.
When there's opposition from the government, for whatever reason, Christianity tends to expand and grow like crazy. So it's like you try to stamp it out, it only grows.
Yeah.
So one of the fears I think people have is, well, what if we're not a Christian nation anymore? What if we get people in power who don't believe in God? And the truth is, we're seeing that, and we may continue to see that. And I'd venture to say that is not a bad thing.
Right.
Now, does that mean we don't vote for the people we think have our values? Absolutely. We do that. We vote, we exercise our rights that we have here in this country. But if it's not a Christian nation, it doesn't surprise God. He's not taking off his throne. He's not like, well, no, we can't get Christians in here. What are we going to do now? He's going, I got this, guys. Just wait and see what I'm going to do. And if the church, body of Christ, would stand up and do what we're called to do and be salt and light to this world, we're going to see the world changed for better.
For sure.
I think just as we close here tonight, do we have any questions?
No.
As we close here tonight, some of the main things I just want to just make sure we understand. Be gracious to each other who disagree with you on this issue. There's just too much hate, there's too much stuff going on right now that honestly I don't think glorifies Jesus. Yelling at your friends one way because either they don't love each other because they disagree, or the other side, that they don't have enough faith. Both are wrong approaches. I think as Christians especially, we need to show grace to one another, show grace to your government leaders, show grace to your teachers and school administrators, show grace to your pastors and churches and those who are trying their best to do the right thing. That doesn't mean we never challenge it, we never ask questions. Do all those things too, but just do it in a good way. Do it in a loving way. And then I'd say, man, we really just need to make sure that we are seeing what God's at work.
Yeah.
What is God doing? What's He want to do? Where does He want to move us? And God may have something even better in store than we have. So,
And I would say this, John MacArthur, we're praying for you in your ministry. Small church in the middle of nowhere, we're praying for you in your ministry. Healthcare workers, we're praying for your influence. Like we're going to be people intentionally praying regardless of where we stand on it. And God uses this for His glory. Instead of us take more concern about a stand, we're going to be in prayer. We're going to be on our knees. We're going to be focused on being the body, unified, however this plays out.
So if you have any more questions for us, you can text them to redemption at 94,000. We'd love to hear from you. So if this brought up some certain things from you, questions you had about